The most painful sound a son can hear is not a gunshot. It is his mother calling his name in fear. Rain drifted softly across a quiet neighborhood in Charlotte, North Carolina, while porch lights glowed against wet sidewalks and tired hospital workers slowly returned home after long overnight shifts. But near the corner of Brookhaven Drive, flashing police lights suddenly shattered the peaceful silence as a dark patrol SUV stopped behind an aging silver sedan driven by 67-year-old Evelyn Brooks. The elderly black woman adjusted her nursing jacket nervously while red and blue reflections flickered across her windshield because although she had spent nearly 40 years caring for strangers inside emergency rooms, encounters with police officers still tightened something deep inside her chest every single time. Officer Nathan Doyle stepped out into the rain with sharp, impatient movements while another younger officer followed several feet behind him carrying a flashlight. And from the moment Doyle saw Evelyn through the driver's side window, his posture already carried the dangerous confidence of someone who believed suspicion mattered more than certainty. "Turn the engine off and keep your hands visible," Doyle ordered loudly before Evelyn could even finish lowering her window, and although she immediately complied, the tension in his voice only seemed to rise further when he noticed her trembling hands searching carefully for her wallet beside the center console. "Sir, I just got off work at Mercy Hospital," Evelyn explained softly while reaching toward her nursing identification badge hanging around her neck. But Doyle interrupted before she could finish speaking because some people stop listening the moment they decide what kind of story they want to believe. Imagine standing alone on a dark street after a 12-hour hospital shift while strangers with badges treat your exhaustion like guilt simply because your skin makes them feel suspicious. Because several nearby neighbors had already stepped onto their porches watching the encounter unfold beneath the rain-soaked streetlights, Doyle glanced briefly toward the silver sedan before speaking into his shoulder radio, repeating details from a vague dispatch alert involving a vehicle loosely connected to a nearby theft report. Even though the license plate numbers did not fully match and the original suspect description remained incomplete, yet standing there beneath the flashing lights, Doyle acted as though uncertainty itself justified escalation. "Step out of the vehicle slowly," he demanded sharply, while the younger female officer standing behind him hesitated almost imperceptibly after noticing Evelyn's hospital badge and trembling voice. Evelyn obeyed carefully, stepping into the cold rain with visible confusion while clutching her purse tightly against her chest. And somewhere down the block a cell phone camera quietly began recording from inside a neighbor's doorway. Because people living in neighborhoods like this learn quickly when situations no longer feel safe. "I have done nothing wrong," Evelyn whispered softly while rainwater rolled down the side of her face. But Doyle barely acknowledged her words because he was too focused performing authority for the growing audience watching nearby. Then suddenly a loud crash echoed from a nearby alley after a garbage container tipped over in the heavy wind. And within seconds the atmosphere transformed completely as officers reacted in panic, while neighbors shouted from porches and flashing lights bounced violently across wet pavement. The younger female officer immediately stepped backward in alarm, while Evelyn instinctively raised her hands higher, trying desperately to show she was not a threat. But confusion spread faster than reason. Beneath the rain-soaked darkness surrounding the street, somewhere in the chaos, a neighbor screamed for someone to call an ambulance, while a cell phone slipped from trembling hands onto the pavement beside the curb. And then, almost terrifyingly fast, the entire neighborhood fell into stunned silence broken only by rain tapping softly against police vehicles. Evelyn Brooks lay motionless near the side of her silver sedan, while her hospital identification badge rested in a puddle beneath flashing patrol lights. And standing frozen several feet away, Officer Nathan Doyle slowly realized the situation no longer belonged to him anymore. Rain continued falling across Brookhaven Drive, while flashing emergency lights painted trembling red and blue reflections across the soaked neighborhood pavement. And standing beside the silver sedan, with stunned silence spreading across his face, Officer Nathan Doyle suddenly looked far less confident than he had only moments earlier, because the situation unfolding in front of him no longer resembled routine policing. It resembled irreversible consequence. Evelyn Brooks remained motionless near the curb while paramedics rushed through the rain carrying medical equipment beneath shouting voices and flashing ambulance lights, and scattered beside her on the wet pavement lay a small nurse identification badge covered in raindrops. The words Mercy Hospital Emergency Department still visible beneath the streetlight glow. The younger female officer knelt nearby, visibly shaken, while neighbors continued recording from porches and sidewalks, their whispered conversations growing louder with every passing second because everyone there understood the same painful truth. The elderly black woman had been trying to cooperate from the beginning. She told us she worked at the hospital. One neighbor shouted angrily from beneath an umbrella while another pointed toward the cell phone footage still recording from a front porch across the street. And somewhere in the growing chaos, Doyle kept repeating the same weak sentence into his shoulder radio. We had a possible vehicle match. Imagine watching your mother's hospital badge lying in the rain while strangers argue about procedure instead of humanity, because several blocks away inside a quiet downtown gym. Colonel Isaiah Brooks stared silently at his vibrating phone without yet realizing the call about to change his life forever was coming from one of his mother's terrified neighbors. Isaiah answered immediately after seeing the caller identification, and the moment he heard panic trembling through the woman's voice, every muscle in his body tightened with the disciplined stillness of someone trained for crisis long before tonight. Isaiah, the neighbor whispered breathlessly over distant sirens. It is your mother. Police stopped her. Something went wrong. For several seconds Isaiah said absolutely nothing while the sounds of rain and emergency vehicles echoed faintly through the phone speaker. And then in a voice so controlled it almost sounded emotionless, he asked only one question. Is she alive? Back on Brookhaven Drive, paramedics carefully loaded Evelyn into the ambulance, while nearby neighbors openly challenged officers about what they witnessed, and even some younger police officers standing at the perimeter now looked deeply uncomfortable because body cameras were still recording every second of the scene unfolding beneath the rain-soaked streetlights. Doyle attempted speaking with arriving supervisors, but his words came out rushed and defensive now, the certainty that fueled him. Earlier rapidly dissolving beneath cell phone footage, witness statements, and the horrifying realization that the woman involved never matched the original suspect description completely. The female officer finally stood and looked directly at Doyle with visible disbelief in her eyes. The dispatch report said dark blue SUV, she said quietly, glancing toward Evelyn's older silver sedan. This was never even close. Doyle looked away immediately because once fear loses control of the narrative, facts become impossible to ignore. 20 minutes later, a black SUV rolled silently into the neighborhood through the rain, stopping several houses away from the flashing emergency lights, while neighbors continued gathering along soaked sidewalks and porch steps. Isaiah Brooks stepped out wearing a dark coat over a black thermal shirt, and, despite the storm surrounding him emotionally and physically, his movements remained unnervingly calm as he walked slowly toward the ambulance scene without speaking to anyone. Imagine arriving too late to protect the person who spent her entire life protecting you. Because Isaiah's eyes immediately found his mother's nursing badge still lying abandoned near the curb beneath the flashing lights. And for one brief second the disciplined control across his face nearly cracked beneath the weight of what he was seeing. A young officer instinctively moved to stop him from crossing the police line. But the moment Isaiah raised his eyes toward him, something about the cold stillness in that gaze made the officer hesitate immediately. Doyle finally noticed Isaiah approaching through the rain and stepped forward defensively, while neighbors lifted phones higher to continue recording, unaware that the quiet black man walking toward him carried a level of authority far beyond anything visible on the street that night. Then Isaiah stopped beside the rain-soaked nursing badge on the pavement, slowly bent down to pick it up, and in a voice quieter than the falling rain itself asked the question that instantly silenced everyone nearby. Who gave the order? Rainwater rolled slowly down Isaiah Brooks's dark coat, while flashing emergency lights reflected across the soaked pavement of Brookhaven Drive. And the moment his quiet question cut through the chaos surrounding the ambulance scene, the entire street seemed to fall into an uncomfortable silence because everyone there could feel something shifting emotionally even before they understood who he really was. Officer Nathan Doyle stepped forward defensively beneath the rain while trying to regain the confidence already slipping from his voice. But standing face to face with Isaiah felt different from dealing with frightened civilians earlier. because Isaiah carried himself with the cold, disciplined stillness of someone completely familiar with pressure, someone trained to remain calm while everyone else lost control. "Sir, you need to step back and let medical personnel work," Doyle ordered sharply while neighbors continued recording from porches and sidewalks nearby. But Isaiah never moved his eyes away from the ambulance doors where paramedics worked urgently around his mother inside. Imagine standing in the rain holding your mother's hospital badge, while strangers who terrified her moments earlier still speak to you like you are the problem. Because several neighbors watching from across the street could already see the emotional difference between the two men standing beneath the flashing lights, one fueled by authority, the other controlled by discipline. Isaiah slowly slipped Evelyn's nursing badge into his coat pocket before finally turning toward Doyle completely. And when he spoke again, his voice remained almost unnervingly calm. "You stopped the wrong vehicle," he said quietly. "You ignored dispatch inconsistencies, and now my mother is inside that ambulance." Doyle immediately tried defending the stop again by repeating details about a possible theft suspect connected to a vehicle description. But now even the younger officers nearby looked uncomfortable hearing the explanation, because every witness standing there had already noticed how badly the original report failed to match Evelyn's silver sedan. The young female officer finally stepped forward despite visible hesitation and spoke softly toward Isaiah. "Sir." She complied the entire time, and the guilt in her voice landed heavily across the soaked street because nobody there could deny Evelyn had been trying to cooperate from the beginning. Isaiah nodded once toward her without anger because deep down he understood fear spreads quickly inside unprepared people, but what he could not ignore was how easily Doyle transformed uncertainty into aggression before verifying anything properly. Nearby paramedics finally closed the ambulance doors while rain tapped softly against the vehicle roof, and the sound somehow felt louder than the shouting from earlier, because silence after tragedy often hurts more than chaos itself. Doyle glanced toward the crowd still filming with growing frustration, because live-stream clips from the scene had already begun spreading across local social media pages. And somewhere in the comments people were asking the same question repeatedly: why was an elderly nurse treated like a dangerous suspect in the first place? Then suddenly another black SUV turned slowly onto Brookhaven Drive, followed closely by two unmarked federal vehicles, their headlights cutting through the rain, while several officers at the scene instinctively straightened their posture immediately. Doyle frowned in confusion, while supervisors exchanged nervous glances because nobody had requested federal presence officially. Yet the vehicles stopped with unmistakable purpose directly beside the flashing patrol cars. A tall gray-haired military officer stepped out first beneath the rain, carrying a black umbrella while scanning the chaotic scene with visible concern before his eyes finally landed on Isaiah, standing silently near the ambulance. The officer immediately crossed the street without hesitation and stopped directly in front of him before speaking words that changed the emotional atmosphere of the entire neighborhood instantly. "Commander Brooks," the man said firmly while several nearby officers looked up in shock. "Washington was notified the moment your name appeared in the incident report." Doyle's face tightened visibly beneath the flashing lights, because for the first time all night genuine uncertainty finally broke through his arrogance completely. Neighbors lowered their phones slightly while younger officers exchanged confused whispers after hearing the title spoken aloud. And somewhere near the edge of the crowd, one elderly man quietly muttered, "That is not just some regular guy." Isaiah never reacted emotionally to the reveal around him, because his attention remained fixed entirely on the ambulance carrying his mother away through the rain-soaked neighborhood streets. And after several long seconds, he looked toward Doyle one final time before speaking with terrifying calmness. "You thought tonight would end with paperwork," he said softly, "but now it becomes an investigation." Rain continued pouring across Brookhaven Drive, while federal vehicles idled beside local patrol cars beneath the flashing red and blue lights. And standing near the ambulance lane with his mother's rain-soaked nursing badge still resting inside his coat pocket, Isaiah Brooks looked less like a grieving son and more like a man silently measuring every failure unfolding around him. The gray-haired military officer remained beside him under the umbrella while local supervisors scrambled nervously through dispatch logs and witness statements nearby, because once the words "Commander Brooks" spread across the scene, The emotional balance of authority shifted instantly beneath the storm-soaked neighborhood. Officer Nathan Doyle tried speaking with his supervising sergeant near the patrol SUV. But every explanation coming out of his mouth sounded weaker now than it had even minutes earlier, because cell phone videos from neighbors were already circulating online showing Evelyn Brooks cooperating calmly before panic consumed the encounter. Imagine arriving home after saving lives inside a hospital all day only to become feared by the very people sworn to protect your neighborhood. Because several neighbors watching from nearby porches now openly spoke about how respectfully Evelyn always treated everyone on the block. "She brought groceries to my mother last winter," one elderly man said quietly, while recording continued across dozens of phones. "That woman never caused problems for anybody." The younger female officer who had questioned the stop earlier now stood silently near the curb staring at the soaked pavement where Evelyn collapsed moments before, and the guilt across her face seemed heavier than the rain still falling around the scene, because deep down she understood she should have challenged Doyle sooner. Isaiah finally turned toward the approaching supervisors while distant thunder rolled softly over Charlotte. And although grief sat visibly behind his eyes now, his voice remained frighteningly calm when he spoke. "I want every body camera secured immediately," he said quietly. "No edits, no delays, no missing footage." The supervising sergeant nodded almost instantly, because something about Isaiah's composure made resistance feel impossible. And within minutes, officers began removing body camera units for evidence processing, while federal personnel documented the scene carefully beneath portable floodlights. Doyle watched the investigation begin unraveling around him with growing panic, because what started earlier as a traffic stop built on assumptions was now transforming into a federal-level review involving military officials, internal affairs, neighborhood recordings, and inconsistent dispatch records. Then one of the federal agents stepped toward Isaiah holding a tablet already displaying synchronized footage timestamps gathered from local police systems. And after quietly reviewing several clips beneath the rain, the agent's expression hardened immediately. The original dispatch description listed a dark blue SUV driven by a male suspect. He stated carefully, while supervisors nearby exchanged alarmed glances. "Your mother was driving a silver sedan alone." Silence spread through the neighborhood again, because nobody there needed further explanation anymore. Doyle attempted speaking up defensively about suspicious behavior and officer safety, but the words collapsed almost instantly beneath the growing mountain of evidence, exposing how quickly assumptions replaced procedure during the stop. Isaiah slowly looked toward Doyle while ambulance sirens faded into the distance, carrying his mother toward Mercy Hospital. And for several seconds he said nothing at all, because disappointment spoken too early can sound like anger, but silence forces people to confront themselves first. Nearby, a neighbor replayed cell phone footage showing Evelyn lifting her hands repeatedly while trying to explain she was a nurse returning home from work, and hearing her trembling voice through the speakers caused even some officers standing nearby to lower their eyes uncomfortably. "She was scared from the beginning," the female officer whispered quietly, almost to herself. Then Isaiah finally stepped closer toward Doyle beneath the rain, while every nearby camera remained fixed on the moment unfolding between them. And in a voice colder than the storm itself, he asked one final question that seemed to freeze the entire street in place. "Did you ever see my mother as a citizen?" he said softly. "Or only as a threat the moment you saw her skin?" Doyle opened his mouth, but no answer came, because deep down he already understood the terrifying truth standing in front of him. There was no body camera angle, no rewritten report, and no excuse powerful enough to erase what everyone on that street had already witnessed with their own eyes. Mercy Hospital glowed against the dark Charlotte skyline like a lonely island of white light surrounded by rain and police sirens. And inside the emergency waiting area, Colonel Isaiah Brooks sat completely still beneath the cold fluorescent ceiling, while doctors worked behind closed doors trying to stabilize the woman who had spent most of her life saving strangers inside those same hallways. The soaked nursing badge recovered from the street rested silently beside him on the plastic chair. And every passing doctor, nurse, and hospital employee who recognized Evelyn Brooks carried the same expression of disbelief after hearing what happened only blocks away from the place where she had worked for nearly 4 decades. Imagine surviving war zones overseas only to feel helpless sitting outside an operating room because your mother was harmed on the same streets she spent years helping protect through compassion instead of fear, because Isaiah had faced gunfire, explosions, and military operations during his years commanding Delta Force teams. Yet none of those memories felt as heavy as waiting silently outside that hospital room tonight. Nearby televisions mounted high on the waiting room walls replayed breaking local news coverage showing cell phone footage from Brookhaven Drive, while reporters discussed the rapidly growing investigation surrounding the traffic stop. And with every replay, the emotional pressure surrounding the Charlotte Police Department intensified further because witnesses, dispatch records, and neighborhood videos all pointed toward the same painful conclusion. Officer Nathan Doyle sat alone several floors below inside a temporary internal affairs interview room, while investigators reviewed synchronized body camera footage frame by frame, and the confidence that once shaped his posture earlier that evening had disappeared completely beneath exhaustion, fear, and the growing realization that every decision he made was now being dissected publicly and federally. You escalated. Before confirming the vehicle match, one investigator stated firmly, while replaying footage showing Evelyn Brooks calmly identifying herself as a nurse returning home from work, and Doyle struggled to respond, because hearing his own voice from the footage sounded harsher now than it ever had in his head during the stop. Upstairs, the young female officer involved in the encounter approached Isaiah, cautiously holding a cup of untouched coffee in trembling hands. And despite the guilt visible across her face, Isaiah immediately recognized something important in her expression. Regret meant she still understood the difference between authority and humanity. "Sir," she whispered softly while sitting several feet away from him in the nearly empty waiting room. "I should have stopped it sooner." Isaiah looked toward her quietly for several seconds before answering, because anger came easily in moments like this, but truth required something calmer and heavier. "Fear spreads quickly when nobody challenges it," he said softly while distant thunder rolled outside the hospital windows. "That is how good people become silent inside bad moments." Tears immediately filled the young officer's eyes because deep down she knew he was right. Across the city, cell phone clips from the incident continued spreading rapidly online, while public outrage intensified after reporters uncovered earlier complaints involving Doyle's interactions with black civilians during previous stops. And suddenly what happened to Evelyn Brooks no longer looked isolated. It looked like a pattern finally exposed beneath public attention. Then shortly after midnight, a senior federal investigator entered the waiting area carrying a thick evidence folder, while several hospital staff members quietly stepped aside, recognizing Isaiah immediately. "Commander Brooks," the investigator said carefully before taking a seat beside him. "We secured the body camera files, dispatch audio, and neighborhood recordings." Isaiah nodded once without emotion because deep down he already understood the evidence would confirm what every witness on Brookhaven Drive saw with their own eyes earlier. The investigator hesitated briefly before continuing. "There is something else you should know," he said quietly, sliding several printed complaints across the chair beside Isaiah. "Officer Doyle has multiple prior conduct reports involving aggressive stops against black residents." Isaiah lowered his eyes toward the paperwork while rain tapped softly against the hospital windows behind him. And for the first time all night, genuine pain finally crossed his face, because suddenly this no longer felt like one terrible mistake. It felt like a warning ignored too many times by too many people. Somewhere down the hallway, a heart monitor beeped steadily inside Evelyn Brooks's hospital room, while doctors continued working around her. And sitting silently beneath the cold waiting room lights, Isaiah slowly closed the evidence folder before speaking words so calm they felt almost unbearable to hear. "The danger was never one officer," he said quietly. "The danger was how many chances he was given before tonight." The rain outside Mercy Hospital finally began fading into a cold mist drifting across the empty Charlotte streets. But inside the emergency waiting floor, the emotional pressure surrounding Evelyn Brooks only continued growing heavier, because every passing minute brought new evidence, new witness statements, and new revelations exposing how quickly a routine stop transformed into public tragedy. Colonel Isaiah Brooks remained seated beneath the fluorescent lights with his mother's nursing badge resting beside him while doctors moved urgently through nearby hallways. And although exhaustion now shadowed his face after hours without rest, the discipline holding him together still felt almost unnaturally controlled. Imagine sitting outside a hospital room listening to strangers discuss procedure and paperwork, while the woman who raised you fights silently behind closed doors because someone mistook her fear for danger, because Isaiah understood something painful that night. Systems rarely collapse all at once. They erode slowly every time warnings are ignored. Downstairs inside Internal Affairs headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from defensive confusion to full investigative urgency after technicians synchronized dispatch recordings with body camera timestamps. And once the timeline aligned completely, several investigators exchanged stunned looks because the truth became impossible to deny anymore. Officer Nathan Doyle received the dispatch correction nearly 40 seconds before escalating the stop further, meaning he already knew the suspect vehicle description no longer matched Evelyn Brooks's silver sedan. He continued anyway. One investigator whispered quietly while replaying the footage again, and the silence inside the room afterward felt heavier than anger because every person there understood the difference between panic and choice. Meanwhile, local news stations interrupted overnight programming with special coverage as reporters revealed additional complaints filed previously against Doyle involving aggressive stops in predominantly black neighborhoods. And suddenly public outrage across Charlotte exploded beyond the single incident itself, because people no longer saw an isolated mistake. They saw a pattern finally dragged into the light. Upstairs, Isaiah slowly stood after hearing footsteps approach from down the hospital corridor, and moments later a tired emergency physician removed his surgical mask before offering the first real update since Evelyn arrived. "Your mother is stable," the doctor said softly while exhaustion showed clearly across his face. "She is awake now." For the first time all night, Isaiah's expression finally shifted visibly as relief moved quietly through him beneath the emotional armor he carried since arriving at Brookhaven Drive. And although he closed his eyes only briefly, the weight of nearly losing the only parent he had left seemed to pass silently across his face like another storm. The young female officer involved in the stop stood nearby when the update arrived, and tears immediately filled her eyes because hearing Evelyn survived somehow made the guilt surrounding the entire night feel even more real. Isaiah thanked the doctor calmly before walking slowly toward his mother's hospital room, and through the partially open doorway he could already see Evelyn resting beneath dim medical lighting with monitoring equipment humming softly beside her bed. She looked smaller somehow, surrounded by white sheets and hospital machines. Smaller than the woman who raised him alone after his father died. Smaller than the nurse who spent decades comforting frightened strangers during their worst moments. And standing there silently in the doorway, Isaiah suddenly looked less like a Delta Force commander and more like a son trying not to break apart emotionally. Evelyn slowly opened her eyes after sensing him nearby. And despite everything that happened earlier that night, her first instinct was still concern for him instead of herself. "Baby," she whispered weakly, "are you all right?" Imagine hearing your injured mother comfort you while she lies inside a hospital bed, because compassion shaped her more deeply than fear ever could. And Isaiah lowered his head briefly before taking her hand carefully between both of his. "I am here now," he said softly, while rain tapped lightly against the hospital windows behind them. Downstairs, federal investigators finalized emergency suspension paperwork, while reporters gathered outside police headquarters awaiting official statements. And somewhere alone inside an interview room, Officer Nathan Doyle stared silently at paused body camera footage showing Evelyn Brooks raising trembling hands beneath flashing patrol lights moments before everything changed forever. Then one investigator closed the file folder slowly and spoke words that echoed through the building with the finality of judgment itself. "This was not an unavoidable tragedy," he said quietly. "This was preventable from the very beginning." Morning sunlight slowly replaced the storm clouds hanging above Charlotte, North Carolina. But inside Mercy Hospital, the emotional damage left behind from the previous night still lingered heavily across every hallway, television screen, and whispered conversation because the story of Evelyn Brooks had already spread far beyond Brookhaven Drive. Nurses arriving for early shifts stopped quietly outside her hospital room after recognizing the respected emergency department veteran lying weak but stable beneath pale hospital lights. and many of them struggled to understand how a woman who spent decades helping strangers survive trauma became the victim of fear and reckless authority in her own neighborhood. Colonel Isaiah Brooks remained seated beside his mother's bed wearing the same dark coat from the night before, while untouched coffee cooled beside him on a small plastic table. And although exhaustion now rested visibly across his face, his posture never lost the calm discipline that carried him through military command and personal grief alike. Imagine surviving years of overseas conflict only to discover the most painful battlefield is watching your mother suffer because someone ignored humanity long before procedure failed, because Isaiah understood this moment was no longer just about one officer or one traffic stop. It was about every warning sign ignored before tragedy finally reached public attention. Across the city, reporters crowded outside Charlotte Police Headquarters while federal investigators and internal affairs personnel entered through secured doors carrying evidence files, witness transcripts, and synchronized body camera footage. And inside the building, the atmosphere had shifted from defensive damage control into something far more serious: institutional panic. Officer Nathan Doyle sat silently inside a conference room under temporary suspension while investigators reviewed previous complaints attached to his personnel file. And for the first time in his career, nobody interrupted the silence to defend him, justify him, or explain away his behavior as simple stress. One investigator placed multiple printed reports across the table, showing repeated accusations involving aggressive treatment toward black civilians during prior stops. And Doyle stared at the paperwork with growing disbelief, because every ignored complaint now looked less like coincidence and more like a warning nobody wanted to confront early enough. "You were given corrective training twice," one federal reviewer stated calmly while tapping the file folder. Yet the behavior patterns remained consistent. Doyle lowered his eyes without answering, because somewhere deep beneath the collapsing structure of excuses and pride, he finally recognized the terrifying truth that discipline cannot exist inside a person unwilling to question their own fear. Meanwhile, inside Mercy Hospital, the young female officer from Brookhaven Drive approached Isaiah's mother quietly, carrying flowers purchased from the hospital gift shop. And although guilt still weighed visibly across her face, Evelyn Brooks managed a faint, tired smile after seeing her standing nervously in the doorway. "You came," Evelyn whispered softly while monitors beeped steadily nearby. The young officer nodded immediately before tears filled her eyes again. "I should have spoken up sooner," she admitted quietly, and for several seconds the room fell silent except for distant hospital announcements echoing through the corridor outside. Then Evelyn slowly reached out and touched the officer's trembling hand with surprising gentleness despite everything she endured. "Fear spreads fast," she said weakly, "but courage spreads too." Isaiah watched the moment silently from beside the hospital window while morning sunlight reflected across Charlotte's skyline beyond the glass. And something about seeing his mother offer compassion instead of hatred seemed to affect him more deeply than any investigation or disciplinary hearing unfolding downtown. Outside police headquarters, public outrage continued growing after additional neighborhood footage surfaced online showing Evelyn calmly cooperating before the situation escalated unnecessarily. And across social media, thousands of people repeated the same heartbreaking phrase: "She was just trying to go home from work." Then shortly before noon, an official department statement confirmed Officer Nathan Doyle had been suspended pending federal civil rights investigation and administrative review. But inside Evelyn's hospital room, the announcement felt strangely small compared to the deeper emotional truth sitting quietly between mother and son. Isaiah looked toward the nurse badge resting beside Evelyn's bedside flowers before speaking softly in a voice filled more with sorrow than anger. "You spent your whole life helping strangers feel safe," he said quietly. "And last night the people trusted to protect you only saw danger when they looked at you." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, while sunlight warmed the room around them. And somewhere beyond the hospital walls, the city of Charlotte slowly began confronting the same painful realization. Charlotte looked strangely quiet beneath the pale afternoon sunlight, but inside government offices, police conference rooms, and hospital waiting areas across the city, tension continued spreading because the story surrounding Evelyn Brooks no longer belonged to one neighborhood traffic stop. It had become a national conversation about fear, accountability, and the dangerous consequences of unchecked assumptions. Television networks replayed the cell phone footage repeatedly, while legal analysts, retired officers, veterans, and community leaders debated the body camera evidence frame by frame. And every replay seemed to deepen the same painful realization. An elderly black nurse trying to return home from work was treated like a threat before anyone fully confirmed who she was. Colonel Isaiah Brooks remained beside his mother's hospital bed while soft sunlight filtered through the blinds across the room. And although reporters continued requesting interviews outside Mercy Hospital, he refused every camera because somewhere deep inside him, this was never about publicity. It was about protecting the dignity of the woman who raised him. Imagine carrying military medals earned through years of sacrifice while realizing none of that power could shield your own mother from fear disguised as authority on an ordinary neighborhood street. Because Isaiah understood why millions of people connected emotionally to what happened. They recognized themselves inside Evelyn Brooks long before they recognized the headlines. Across town inside Charlotte Police Headquarters, federal investigators continued reviewing additional evidence, while internal affairs personnel interviewed officers separately about the events on Brookhaven Drive. And with each statement, more uncomfortable truths surfaced about how quickly uncertainty escalated into aggressive control once Officer Nathan Doyle decided Evelyn Brooks looked suspicious. One investigator quietly summarized the problem during a closed administrative meeting. He treated perception like evidence, and nobody inside the room disagreed because the footage already proved it repeatedly. Doyle himself remained isolated inside a temporary administrative office, while attorneys and union representatives moved carefully through procedural discussions around him. But the emotional isolation surrounding him now felt impossible to escape because every hallway conversation stopped the moment he appeared, and every television screen replayed the same devastating clips showing Evelyn raising trembling hands beneath flashing lights. For the first time in his career, Doyle understood what it felt like to lose the protection of certainty, because once body camera footage exposed the truth publicly, authority alone could no longer control the narrative. Meanwhile, at Mercy Hospital, several nurses quietly gathered outside Evelyn's room, holding handwritten cards thanking her for decades of kindness inside the emergency department. And seeing their messages stacked beside her flowers affected Isaiah more deeply than any federal investigation ever could, because they reminded him who his mother truly was beyond the trauma dominating the news. She stayed late for patients nobody else wanted. One older nurse whispered emotionally while speaking with Isaiah near the hallway window. Your mother treated every person like they mattered. Isaiah nodded silently because he already knew compassion shaped Evelyn more deeply than fear ever could. Later that evening, federal representatives officially announced a civil rights review into the incident alongside emergency department policy evaluations within the Charlotte Police Department. And outside headquarters, reporters immediately surrounded city officials demanding answers about why earlier complaints against Doyle failed to trigger stronger intervention before tragedy struck. Inside her hospital room, Evelyn slowly watched portions of the coverage on muted television while sunlight faded into evening across the skyline beyond her window. And although pain and exhaustion still weakened her voice, the sadness in her eyes seemed directed less toward herself and more toward the city struggling to confront its own reflection honestly. Isaiah sat quietly beside her while distant hospital announcements echoed softly through the hallway outside. And after several long moments, Evelyn finally turned toward him and whispered something that seemed to stop time itself inside the room. Promise me you will not let this make you hate people. Imagine hearing your injured mother worry more about protecting your heart than her own pain, because love shaped her instincts more deeply than trauma ever could. And Isaiah lowered his eyes briefly before taking her hand carefully in both of his again. I promise, he said softly while evening shadows stretched slowly across the hospital walls. Outside Mercy Hospital, cameras still flashed and reporters still searched for statements. But inside that quiet room, the real story no longer centered around investigations, suspensions, or headlines. It centered around a son realizing the strongest person he ever knew had spent her entire life answering fear with compassion instead of bitterness. 3 weeks later, the rainstorms that once covered Brookhaven Drive had long disappeared. But throughout Charlotte, the memory of what happened to Evelyn Brooks still lingered inside conversations, headlines, police briefings, and quiet family dinners because the incident changed something deeper than policy. It forced an entire city to confront the difference between protection and fear. Mercy Hospital held a small gathering in the emergency department lobby to welcome Evelyn back for the first time since the night everything changed, and nurses lined the hallway quietly applauding while sunlight poured through the large hospital windows across bouquets of flowers, handwritten cards, and photographs from decades of service she had given to strangers during their worst moments. Colonel Isaiah Brooks stood several feet behind his mother wearing a simple dark suit instead of military fatigues, and although cameras from local news stations waited outside the building hoping for interviews, he refused every microphone again because somewhere inside him this story was never meant to become about his rank, his service, or his power. It was always about the woman who taught him dignity before discipline. Imagine nearly losing the person who raised you only to watch her return with more compassion in her heart than bitterness, because Evelyn Brooks walked slowly through that hospital lobby greeting people gently despite everything she survived, and every nurse hugging her seemed to remind Isaiah why strength does not always look loud or powerful. Sometimes it looks like kindness refusing to die after trauma. Across the city, federal investigators officially announced the conclusion of their preliminary review, while Charlotte Police Department leadership unveiled mandatory reforms involving escalation procedures, dispatch verification protocols, and bias intervention training after overwhelming public pressure demanded accountability beyond one suspension. Officer Nathan Doyle resigned quietly before formal termination proceedings could finish, and the news barely caused celebration anymore because for many people in Charlotte, the emotional damage surrounding the case was never about seeing one man fall. It was about understanding how many warning signs had been ignored before tragedy finally forced action. Inside a nearly empty apartment across town, Doyle packed old uniforms, commendations, and patrol equipment into cardboard boxes while muted news coverage replayed interviews with community leaders discussing trust and policing reforms. And somewhere between the silence of that room and the absence of his badge, he finally confronted the truth he spent years avoiding. Authority without discipline eventually destroys itself. Meanwhile, Isaiah accompanied his mother home beneath a calm golden sunset spreading across the Charlotte skyline, and as they slowly pulled into the same neighborhood where flashing patrol lights once reflected through rain and fear, several neighbors stepped onto porches quietly waving toward Evelyn with visible relief and affection. The damaged fear surrounding Brookhaven Drive had not disappeared completely, but something else existed there now too. Witnesses who refused silence, officers forced to confront hard truths, and a community learning that accountability matters most before tragedy happens instead of after. Later that evening, Isaiah sat beside his mother on the front porch, while cicadas hummed softly through the warm Carolina air, and neighborhood children rode bicycles beneath glowing streetlights further down the block, and for the first time since the night of the stop, the silence around them no longer felt heavy. Evelyn looked toward her son carefully, before asking the question sitting quietly inside her heart since leaving the hospital. "Do you still believe people can change?" Isaiah remained silent for several long moments while staring out across the peaceful street where everything nearly fell apart weeks earlier. And then slowly he nodded because despite the pain, the investigations, the humiliation, and the anger, he still understood something his mother never stopped teaching him. People change when truth finally becomes harder to ignore than comfort, he said softly while evening wind moved gently through the trees around them. Evelyn smiled faintly before resting her hand over his, and somewhere in the distance a patrol car passed quietly through the neighborhood without lights or sirens. Just another vehicle moving through an ordinary American street. Then Isaiah looked toward the darkening sky above Charlotte and spoke the final truth that seemed to echo far beyond Brookhaven Drive itself. He thought power came from the badge, he said quietly, but real strength is measured by how carefully you treat the people who cannot fight back.